Antichrist, anti-woman, anti-humanity, anti-Lars von Trier. Lars von Trier's controversial masterpiece, Antichrist, has solidified itself in the public consciousness as an extremely disturbing film. The kind of film you show to your friends just to see their reactions. But this way of looking at the film is missing the forest for the trees, because beneath the graphic imagery lies a complex exploration of the human condition. What is our true nature? Is it good or evil?
In this video, we're going to examine and analyze the meaning behind Antichrist, as well as give some backstory on the making of the film, so that when you show your friends this movie to see their reactions, you can point to the genital mutilation scenes and declare, that's actually very deep. But first, don't forget to like and subscribe if you like this kind of Kino content.
At the Cannes premiere of Antichrist, Lars von Trier declared himself the best film director in the world, making for an extremely memorable Cannes press conference, which would be overshadowed by his Melancholia press conference a couple years later.
What can I say? I understand Hitler. I think he did some wrong things, yes, absolutely. But I can see him sitting in his bunker in the end.
That particular stunt made him persona non grata at Cannes for quite a while, but I doubt he regretted anything. Von Trier made his career out of being a provocateur in both his celebrity persona and in his movies. In fact, by the time Antichrist was released in 2009, Von Trier had been making feature films for over 25 years. With 10 theatrical films under his belt, he had gone through a couple artistic eras, ranging from his highly stylized early films to his turn as a Dogma 95 director, which led to his later films taking on a more documentary quality. Side note, for people who don't know what Dogma 95 is or was, it was an artistic experiment by some Danish directors that sought to purify filmmaking by stripping their films of as much artifice as possible. Films had to be shot on tape or DVD-R in color in the Academy aspect ratio. The camera could only be handheld. It had to be shot on location, and the director couldn't be credited. Basically, it was mumblecore before mumblecore. If you're interested in learning more about Dogma 95, I'll include some links in the description for you to check out. What I'm getting at is that by the time that Lars von Trier started to write Antichrist, he had already enjoyed a long and storied career as a director. In truth, he was tired, anxious, and incredibly depressed. So depressed that he didn't think that he could ever make another film. It was out of this intense anxiety and depression that Antichrist was born.
Before we dive into what this movie means, I want to look at how it was made. Why? Because I'm a nerd. Let's start where all films begin, the script.
Lars von Trier wrote Antichrist as a way to deal with his crippling mental struggles. In it, he blends his anxieties with various therapies with which he was familiar. On one hand, he has the man practice exposure therapy, exposing the woman to what she fears most, in an attempt to coax her into reasoning through her fears and her grief. On the other hand, he incorporates shamanistic journeys. These are the dreamlike mental journeys that the woman takes in her head. This dichotomy, this juxtaposition of therapies translates to the filming techniques, as the film blends what von Trier describes as a monumental style with a documentary style. Slow motion, striking color grading and lighting, and almost excessive compositing define von Trier's monumental style. As for the documentary style, von Trier shot the scenes handheld and edited the scenes roughly, coarsely. In this sense, the film serves as a culmination of all the styles with which he has experimented over the course of his entire career. The two styles required vastly different approaches. For the docu-style portions of the film, von Trier kept the set small, often limiting the crew to just 4 people, including himself. On films before this one, von Trier would hold the camera himself, but he wasn't mentally or physically capable of doing so on this movie, so he reluctantly transferred that responsibility to a cinematographer.
What's perhaps most interesting about how Lars von Trier makes movies is the rather eccentric manner in which he directs actors. He directs them by not directing them. Does that make sense? He doesn't have them rehearse their scenes, and he doesn't block the scenes with them. He lets the actors figure out their blocking and how they'll perform the scenes. His lack of hand-holding doesn't make it easy on the actors, needless to say.
So when they shot the scenes, the actors would perform the same scene in a multitude of different ways. Lars would just tell them to do it again. They never knew exactly what he wanted. They didn't quite know how their characters were emotionally progressing. Because of this, the actor stayed in a state of anxiety, of blindness towards his vision. In reality, he knew exactly what he wanted. He used the different emotions and scenes to cut through time. He could use a jump cut from the woman having a panic attack to her being calm in order to indicate that time had passed. What he wanted from the actors on set for these scenes was to give him enough material to form the film in post-production. There is an upside to this style though. Defoe noted that it made him feel much more like a collaborator than just an actor. Lars von Trier gave him freedom to explore the scene as he imagined it, without any constraints. And freedom may be uncomfortable for most, but it is liberating for others.
It's liberating to have the camera so fluid. You can't control it, and the only thing you can control is the quality of being there and your commitment to the pretending.
His monumental style scenes were filmed much differently. They required a ton of pre-planning due to the nature of the shots. For one, slow motion shots require massive amounts of light. They needed so much light that for some of the shots, they burned out the generator trucks they had on set. That's what happens when you shoot your slow-mo at up to 1,000 frames per second. And because a lot of the monumental shots used compositing and CGI, they had to make sure that everything was lit and framed properly before rolling their cameras. Peter Hjort, von Trier's right-hand man, was instrumental in making his surrealistic and dreamlike images come to life. According to Hjort, von Trier knew precisely what he wanted from every frame, contrasting with the persona he put on for his actors. In these scenes, they had more than just technical hurdles to jump. They had to work with animals. There's a rule of filmmaking that filmmakers regret breaking all the time. Don't work with children, animals, or on water. Lars von Trier broke 2 out of 3 of these. The problem with working with animals is that they're, not human. So you can't just easily explain to them what you want them to do. However, deer and ravens can be trained. Foxes are a bit tougher. All animals, though, can be coaxed with food. If money speaks in the human world, then food speaks in the animal kingdom. For the famous scene in which the fox eats itself, the trainer hid strips of beef under the fox's legs, which the fox ate. They splashed some fake blood on his body and added the rest of the gore in post, giving the illusion that the fox is practicing the age-old tradition of self-cannibalism.
Chaos reigns.
Antichrist is enigmatic. It's an expression of so many dark and twisted feelings that reside within many of us, as well as a visualization of dreams and myth. But there is a through line through all of this, which will help us gain more of an understanding of the meaning, or rather one potential meaning, of the film.
Remember how just a couple minutes ago we were talking about the 2 contrasting styles? That of the monumental style and that of the documentary style. I mean, if you forgot already, then you probably need to get checked out. These contrasting styles aren't for nothing. In fact, they embody 2 clashing worldviews in the context of the movie. That of the rational and materialist outlook as personified by the man, and that of the metaphysical, mythical perspective embodied by the woman in Eden.
After the tragic death of their child, grief overcomes the woman so massively that she becomes bedridden. The man, taking on the role of her therapist, attempts to help her overcome her grief and anxieties by means of exposure therapy. He thinks that if he can expose her to what she fears most, then she can use her rationality to jettison her fears. And what is it that she fears? The woods, Eden. Lars von Trier's depiction of nature is not the same illustration given to us by Rousseau. Quite the opposite. In Antichrist, nature is a place of death, of evil.
Satan's church.
Say, Jesus.
Nature is Satan's church.
Infanticide, self-destruction, and murder reign supreme here.
There is some sort of a harmony. It is the harmony of overwhelming and collective murder.
One of the man's first visions of Eden is that of a dead fetus hanging out of the back of a deer. This theme of dead and dying children persists throughout the film. The acorns fall from their mother oak all night, doomed to die. The baby bird falls from its nest, only to be swarmed by voracious ants before its mother snatches up its lifeless body and feasts on her own progeny. Memories of their deceased sons surround them in the forest. In Eden, they cannot escape the fall. And just as she dissolves into the landscape during her mental journey through Eden, she becomes one with nature in the second half of the film, taking on all of its properties, its cruelty and rage. In the lore of the movie, the history of genocide is the history of men fighting nature, as nature, described as the church of Satan by the woman, can possess only women.
So, in essence, the battle between the sexes metamorphosizes into a battle between man and nature, man and his inner nature, order and chaos. The evil that possesses the woman is not inherent to just her, it's in all of us. But that is why the man must kill the woman, because by doing so, he conquers nature, he restores order, he brings the three beggars back to life, and he brings a sense of peace and wholeness back to Eden, however uneasy it might be.
But to conquer nature, he has to give into the mythical world. It's obvious that the portrayal of exposure therapy in this film is a sarcastic one. How can one rationalize away the anxiety brought upon us by death? That would mean rationalizing away our very core beings. No amount of exposure to our worst nature or to our mortality can make it any easier. The man tries to use reason to destroy the unreasonable. It's absurd.
Can't I just be afraid without a definite object?
We notice a shift in the man's acceptance of the spiritual nature of the world with the camera work, as scenes with him become less cinema verite and more cinematic. By the end, as at the beginning, the film wholly embraces the monumental style. To cure his wife of her grief, he must explore her inner being in her past. We first see Eden in her mind, and von Trier's scene of the train to Eden reflects the car driving scene in Tchiakovsky's Solaris. It's a dreamlike journey to this mysterious wood, giving the location a character of its own, or at least allowing it to act as a reflection or possessor of the woman's character. When the man climbs into the attic, a metaphor for climbing into her head, he finds graphic depictions of violence against women over the past centuries. In her book, he finds that she at least attempted her thesis, but as time passed, her writing degenerated into illegible lines. Lars von Trier admits that this scene is a reflection of his own depression, as his writing quality deteriorates as he becomes more and more depressed. Another major motif that cannot be missed is the juxtaposition of pleasure and pain. Von Trier presents it at the beginning, as he cuts between the frightful face of the soon-to-die child and the pleasured face of the climaxing woman. In her grief, she associates death with that moment of intense sexual pleasure. She also uses sex and pain as a means of escaping her own inner torment. Sex brings pleasure, however temporary that may be, and physical pain is controllable, unlike existential pain. If she's only thinking about an intense physical feeling that she's experiencing in that moment, then all else fades away. But she can't ignore her inner demons forever. She has to confront them and conquer them, or allow them to subjugate her to their will. I think we know what happens. But this puts her, how shall we say, circumcision scene into perspective. She rejects any sexual pleasure as she closely associates it with the death of her son. The other moment in the film in which von Trier brings pleasure and pain together in one graphic image is a scene in which the man ejaculates blood. I don't think I need to say anything more about it. Just thinking about that brings me pain.
Speaking of vaginas and penises, I couldn't have been the only one to notice all the yonic and phallic imagery in this movie.
The foxhole in which the raven is buried contrasts with the lone, barren tree. There is a sense of the divide of the sexes within the landscape of Eden. As the man enters into the attic to discover the woman's depression, he crawls into the foxhole to understand her nature. Furthermore, Lars von Trier refrains from naming either protagonist, calling them he and she in the credits. He also blurs the faces of all the extras. The effect is the elevation of these human characters into archetypes. They are man and woman, caught in an eternal cycle of anxiety, horror, and feuding, connected to each other and separated from each other by nature. I don't think it's a coincidence that the forest is named Eden, but I doubt I have to explain the significance of that. Lastly, let's examine the three beggars: pain, grief, and despair. symbolized by the deer, fox, and the crow. What is the meaning behind the three beggars? The stages of grief? Maybe they're an inversion of the three magi who gave gifts to Christ at his birth. Some have also suggested that they are representative of the id, ego, and superego. But judging by the rest of the film, I highly doubt that's the case. Von Trier chose these animals because they came to him in shamanic journeys. There's definitely an emotional weight to them, but their rational purpose is much more enigmatic. I think that could be said for Antichrist as a whole. It's visceral and extremely emotional. We can logically understand it to an extent, but it's important for us to embrace the irrationality of the film, just as the man learns to accept the irrationality of Eden.
There's a reason that Antichrist remains one of the most well-known films in the European art horror genre. Beneath its shocks and scares lies a mystical, cryptic, and humanistic story of loss, grief, and sadness. No matter if you love it or hate it, you leave the film a changed person. That is the power of Antichrist. And yeah, supposedly Willem Dafoe offered to do the porn scenes himself, but his member was so large that it shocked Lars von Trier. They hired a porn actor with a smaller penis than Willem. I knew you degenerates were just waiting for me to tell the story. I'm the Kino Corner, and I will see you all in the next video. Hey guys, thanks for making it to this part of the video. As you can see right next to me is a bit of fan art that is Son of the Mask mixed with Antichrist. If you have any fan art, send it to me and I'll include it in upcoming videos. I just wanted to say I'm sorry for not coming out with more horror film reviews this month. I was really meaning to get around to it, but commissions, jobs, VidCon, all that kind of stuff got in the way. But what I can say is that for the next few months, I will be covering a lot of horror movies on this channel. So if you like this review, stay tuned because there's more to come. Thank you all so very much.